The most religious cities in America are places that you might suspect.
Like Dallas, Houston, or Atlanta.
However, there's a weird inclusion here, a city in California where close to 30% are monthly attenders.
What city is that? And what cities are the least religious in the country?
To help us all break it down, we've got on the show with us today Ryan Burge, who is the preeminent source on data and faith. So, let's dive in. Well, hey there, and welcome to the Pro Church Tool Show. We're here to help you and your church navigate the biggest communication shift in 500 years. I'm Brady Shearer, your host. I'm joined as always by my co-host. It's Alexander Mills.
Hello, hello.
And who better to help us make sense of the changing landscape than one of my absolute favorite sources of data? It's Ryan Burge from Graphs About Religion. Ryan, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Brady. Appreciate it.
We are thrilled to have you. We so frequently cite you on the show. And so to bring you on as the primary source for a lot of what we talk about on a secondary basis is great. You recently published an article that caught my eye roughly about a month ago with the title, "Which Cities Are the Least Religious?" And you kind of kick off that article with something that I wanted you to help me make sense of, because you say that the United States Census Bureau is prohibited from asking questions about religion on their once a decade census. Is that true? And if so, how do we have numbers on this at all?
Yeah, so the Census Bureau is very conservative in that they don't want to ask any question on there that can potentially be used for something nefarious. I guess the question that guides them is, do we absolutely have to ask this question or not? And if we don't, then we shouldn't. And so I guess religion is seen as an optional question, which, I mean, for me, it's not, but for a lot of people, it is. It's just not part of their, core belief or core belonging or core whoever they are. So questions like race, number of children, income, education, those are sort of meaningful from a governmental standpoint for things like grants and aid, knowing where the money needs to go, infrastructure, things like that. So the Census Bureau since 1976 has been prohibited from asking about religion on the decennial. The decennial is the big one. That's the one that we use to count people for apportionment for, Congress, House of Representatives. Now, what's nice about the Census Bureau is they don't just do the decennial. They do all these other surveys too. One's called the American Community Survey, and the one that I got a hold of is called the Household Pulse Survey, which is brand new. They just rolled it out last year. And on the Household Pulse Survey, they can ask about things that are more ancillary. So things like mental health, things like how much you go to church, all kinds of not that core is the decennial. This is like an additional product, and the goal is to collect it quick and disseminate it quickly so that stakeholders can really understand what's going on the ground right now, not 2 or 3 or 4 years ago.
Understood. And so you used that data to compile one of the graphs, and it basically had the top as the least religious cities. The top two were San Francisco and Seattle, which probably don't come as a huge surprise to most people watching and listening. In both cases, for those cities, about 7 in 10 adults are attending religious services less than once a year. You said that San Francisco probably takes the crown for most secular if you had to choose between the two, because just 12% of folks in that city are attending church at least once a month. The most religious cities on the other side of the equation, Dallas, Houston, Atlanta, and then one weird addition, Riverside, California, where nearly 3 in 10 folks living in that metropolitan area are monthly attenders. Do we have any explanation? Because I do not consider California top of my list when I think about highly religious cities. Why Riverside, California snuck their way into that list?
So someone emailed me about this. This is always fun writing a post, because then you get emails like, here, I can explain this to you. And I'm like, okay. Biola University is in Riverside, in the Riverside metro area, which is a large, Christian. And apparently there's, it's not just the university and the seminary. There's it has all this ancillary benefits religiously to the local community. The other thing that I've been told by numerous people is there's a lot of Hispanic Catholics in that part of California. So it's probably a both-and thing. It's probably the Catholic thing. It's probably Biola University. And honestly, California is probably more religious than a lot of people think it is. There's this great book called From Bible Belt to Sun Belt by Darren Dochik, I think, that was written maybe 5 or 10 years ago, that basically explains how evangelicals move from the Bible Belt, the way we understand it today, out west, really kind of facing the new economy that's going on out there. So think about guys like Rick Warren or John MacArthur, right? They're both California guys. There's a lot of growing churches in Southern California because there's a lot of people moving, or were at least, moving to Southern California. So I don't think California, Southern California especially, is as irreligious as we think it is. I think a lot of us think of, for instance, the San Francisco Bay Area and go, they're not very religious. But other parts of California, like the Inland Empire, San Bernardino, moving like inside California, away from the coast, it actually is pretty conservative culturally, and it's more religious. So California is a huge state, man. Like think about like San Diego to Sacramento, and you got Big Sur, and you've got mountains and desert and ocean and beaches, and it's hard to conceptualize California with one metric.
Yeah, that's so informative, Ryan. I was just listening to John Mark Comer talk this week, and he was talking about Portland and how he spent a lot of his life working and pastoring in Portland, and now he lives in LA. And he said, like, LA, famously, they refer to themselves as Babylon, but he says LA is like the promised land compared to Portland. Like, just it's a way more religious, way more Christian landscape than Portland. But you just touched on two things about California, specifically in the context of Riverside. You talked about education in the university, and then there's a racial component as well. What correlations do you think we can draw between church attendance and things like that, like race, education, income, age?
Yeah. So actually comparing Portland and LA is actually kind of instructive in that way too, because Portland is a whole lot of really educated white people. And Seattle's the same way, largely, with an Asian population sort of sprinkled in. LA is a much more blue collar city, and a lot more Hispanics and African Americans. And I think that kind of like shows you racially like what in the world's going on there. If you look at education, and this is one thing I tweet about this, like I should almost put it like in my tweet deck just to go out every 3 or 4 months. The relationship between education and attendance, the more educated you are, the more likely you are to attend religious services. Like, that's just a fact. I mean, it shows up, and I've tested that every possible way, and there is absolutely no data that indicates the more educated you are, the less likely you are to go to church. That is just completely empirically false. And I actually look in that piece about the most religious cities, trying to figure out, what are factors that lead to higher or lower levels of attendance. And education in metropolitan areas is not that strongly related, but in the general public, it's incredibly positively related. And now race, white people are a lot less religious than non-white people. And I think that's something that we all need to come to grips with is if you look at it consistently, if you look at like the last 50 years, the share of Americans who are Christians has declined by 25 points or so between 1972 and 2022. But amongst the share of Americans who are non-white Christians was 16% in 1972. It's 17% today. So the entirety of the drop in Christianity in America is among white people. White Christianity is declining. So we're seeing, the rise in black Christians and Hispanic Christians and Asian Christians. White Christianity is it's fading. And Robbie Jones wrote a book about this, The End of White Christian America, and he's largely right. Christianity's not fading. White Christianity is fading, especially in major metropolitan areas. And even in the South, by the way. It's not like Dallas is some bastion of virtue. If you look at the data, almost half of people living in Dallas go to church less than once a year, and only 28% go 12 times or more a year. So even amongst the most religious, quote-unquote, big cities, it's not really that religious either. And a lot of that with Dallas, by the way, the reason they score so highly is because they have such a large African-American and Hispanic population, probably more so than being in the South.
Yeah, so that flies in the face I'm sensing with so many of the popular conceptions of the landscape of faith in North America. We're here in Canada, Ryan, so we kind of like to sneak ourselves in every so often. As a side note, I got a DM this morning from someone. They're like, hey, you have any data from Canada? And I was like, I don't. Ryan, any thoughts that I can share with them?
There's something called the Canadian Social Survey. I have it to get it is an absolute pain in the butt. I'm not gonna lie. Like the way that Canada deals with data is like you're handling like Bitcoin or something. Like you have to give them like a drop of blood and your affiliation and like a photo ID and like what are you going to use this data for? And they anonymize it to a level that's like unbelievable. Like Americans, like we don't have a whole lot of data privacy in this country, which actually works in my benefit big time. Other countries like Europe's really like has a much higher level, and Canada kind of follows the European model. So there is data on Canadians out there. There's a guy named Professor David Speed, who does work on specifically Canadian religion. But that is most certainly not my specialty. I say unapologetically I'm an Americanist. I study American religion. I think American religion is the most unique religion in the world because we're so incredibly educated and economically prosperous, yet we're so incredibly religious at the same time. We don't look at all like Europe or Australia or Canada when we really should. In a lot of metrics, we don't on religion. So the bad thing about what I do is, the good thing about what I do is I have a huge audience. 340 million people live in America, and how many more people are interested in what's going on in America on top of the 340 million. The downside is I never get invited to leave the country. Like, I do tons of speaking events and things like that. I have never, ever been invited to give a speech or a talk outside the United States. So I don't like to fly anyway, so I kind of consider that to be a wash at the end of the day, but it just shows you like how unique American religion is compared to other religions in the world.
Okay, so I'll spin this in a virtuous way in response to that DM. Like, hey, you know what? There isn't a ton of great data, but it's because our great country cares so much about your privacy relative to our neighbors to the south. So I just want to make sure I didn't miss something. You said that there is no correlation between higher levels of education and then decreased church attendance?
Yeah, so in this data that looks just at major metropolitan areas, the relationship between education and attendance is basically no relationship. So more educated doesn't lead to higher levels of attendance or lower levels of attendance. If you look at a general sample, so like everybody in America randomly selected, the relationship between education and attendance is positive, meaning the more educated you are, the more likely you are to attend religious services weekly. And I've looked at that. And if you look at like the share of people who are nuns, the group that's the most likely to be nuns are those with high school diplomas or less. The share of the educational level where you're the least likely to be a nun is having a master's degree. Only 21% of people with master's degrees are nuns. It's over 35% of people without a high school diploma. So the only thing where it works the other direction is belief. People with higher levels of education are less likely to say they have a certain belief in God, which actually kind of tracks if you really look at what education does. It makes you question everything and really be more empirically rigorous. And so that does track. So we call it behavior, belief, and belonging. Belief is the only one where education is negatively related. Amongst belonging and belonging and behavior, it's positively related. More educated, more likely you are to belong to a religious group, and more likely you are to attend religious services weekly.
I just feel like this is so opposite to the popular notion that, once you actually get some good education, you'll come to the clear conclusion that faith in, a sky daddy is extremely, extremely elementary. And yet, what do you take from that? Is that like the Dunning-Krueger effect in reverse? Like the more you know, you realize how little you know and you become more open to a higher power sort of thing?
Yeah, so this is actually part of a larger argument that, like, I always tell people, like, I don't think about religion the same way you probably think about religion because I think about it from a social science. When I say, like, are you religious? I think the average person goes, okay, do I believe in God? Like, that's the heuristic. And from a social science perspective, I honestly think of the 3 Bs, behavior, belief, and belonging, belief is the least important. Like, I really just don't think plus, most people really don't know what they believe anyway. If you really start digging through the data, it's like they don't know. Like, about angels and demons and heaven and hell. Like, lots and lots of people don't believe in hell but believe in heaven. And then you ask them if there's only one way to go to heaven. They're like, not really. Even amongst evangelicals, by the way, the numbers who are exclusivists are very small. So the way I think about it is this. Religion, I wrote a post about this in my Substack last year called Religion is a Luxury Good. Religion has become a luxury good for people who did everything quote unquote right in life. What do I mean by that? College degree, middle class income, married with children. If you do those things, you are significantly more likely to be part of a religious congregation. And that's because you're more likely to be kind of plugged into all facets of society, right? And religion is at its core is an institution. It's a social enterprise. And so what educated people have is higher levels of trust. Institutional trust and interpersonal trust, which means like I don't think the person on the road is going to punch me in the face and steal all my stuff. So if you're going to be part of a religious group, you've got to trust the people, the leaders, the church, the congregation. You got to trust everyone there. And what we know is there's a really strong relationship between education and trust. The more educated you are, the more trusting you are of other people and institutions. So I think there's a growing number of people who have dropped out, who have opted out of American society. But there's still a core of people in America who realize, and by the way, here's the thing that I think we miss is this. The people who are coming to church on Sunday are not the people who are like, I'm 100% right and you're 100% wrong. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. They're going because they realize the social benefit. Now, they like the Jesus part too, probably. But they also enjoy the social benefit of being in part of a community of people who are all kind of like-minded and similarly valued. They got places for their kids to go, right? Because you got the youth ministry, you got the children's church, you got activities going on at the church all the time. You got this, if I need someone to babysit, I can call someone from the church. Same thing, it works reciprocally. Like, I think a lot of people with education realize the tremendous value that comes from the social connections. And I think people who don't trust drop out, and they trust less, so they drop out. So it becomes this downward spiral for a lot of them. So I think we're seeing a smaller group of haves and a growing number of have-nots. So that's when I think about education, like that's the way I conceptualize it, is more than just like gaining head knowledge, it's gaining social intelligence at the same time and valuing community and trusting other people.
Okay, that tracks. So in the metropolitan areas data, you noted that a white person is less likely to attend religious services compared to a person of color. Is that also true, Gen Pop broadly across the whole country?
It is. Yep. White people are amongst white people are the most likely to be nuns right now. And actually, when they leave religion, they're actually the most likely to become atheists or agnostics too. So when they leave further, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm.
There's a group called Nothing in Particular, which is kind of like, I call it the way station, like the transfer station between religion and no religion. Like when black people leave religion, about 90% of them are nothing in particular. When white people leave religion, only 60% of them are nothing in particular. 20% are atheists and 20% are agnostics. So what you kind of see here is that like a lot of white people are going, I'm done, bye. And if you look at if you tangle up politics in this whole thing, it really is like white liberals are really, really anti-religion, much more than black liberals, Hispanic liberals. So it's this kind of combination of if you conceptualize in your head the person working in San Francisco right now, that's the person that hates religion the most. It's like white, educated, upper income, tech worker, no kids, 2 dogs, those are the kind of people who are, they're walking away from all the traditional quote unquote values in American life, like marriage and family and the white picket fence. They're rejecting all those things, and religion is part and parcel of that. So I think it's just heightened in a lot of these metropolitan areas where it's like they've sort of walked so far away from the traditional way that we've understood American life and are choosing to go a different way entirely.
And then it's always, cautionary. You don't want to pull too much from data and infer that it's clearly saying one thing or another. But the other, more straightforward thing that you pulled from this data of the metropolitan areas was, okay, look, older folks go to church more than young folks, which I presume is also true countrywide.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's a huge age gradient when it comes to religion. Older people now, but this is a really important point. And I wrote a book called 20 Myths About Religion and Politics in America, and one of the chapters was the myth is that people become more religious as they age. That is not what happens. Actually, if you look at almost every birth cohort, which are like 5-year windows, like 1940, 1944, 1945 to 1949, all the way through, and you look at their weekly attendance in 2008 versus today, it's down. So like even older people are going to church less than that same cohort was 15 years ago. So there's this thing that happened, this social science thing that happens that I think most people aren't aware of, but really need to be aware of. So people, like whenever we have kids that are 12 and 9 now. At one point they were babies, obviously. We had car seats, and I remember like every older person in my church seeing the car seat and going, back in my day, we just threw you in the back seat and threw the seatbelt on if you were lucky, and we all turned out fine. And the response to that is very simple. It's like, no, not everyone turned out fine, because the ones that did not turn out fine are dead, and you can't talk to them. So it's called survivorship bias. You only see the people that are still there. And so the way this works in church is you look around and see a bunch of gray-haired people and go, oh, people must be coming back to church as they age. You don't see the people who aren't there, because they're not there. So a lot of people, there used to be a whole lot of people in that cohort, and now some of them have dropped away. And who is remaining? People with gray hair. So you might have lost 30% of people who are 70 plus, but there's still a whole lot of them in your church because there was way more of them to start with. So that's one thing we have to be really, really mindful of. It's called survivorship bias. And so this idea is, now older people are more religious than younger people, but every generation, every birth cohort is becoming less religious as time passes. So yes and no, all at the same time, because you got to think like when millennials get in their 60s and 70s, they're going to be a whole heck of a lot less religious than boomers are now in their 70s. And millennials are going to be probably less religious today than millennials were 10 years ago or 20 years ago. So that's what makes social science hard is there's all these age period cohort effects you got to think about over time. But yes, older people tend to be more religious, but they're becoming less religious as they age.
We just talked recently on the show, Ryan, about Gen Z, and we made reference to that, about how they're the least religious generation, and you've done such a great job of kind of quantifying that for us and explaining that, yes, that's true, but that historically, I guess, has always been true, that each generation that follows, each age cohort that follows is less religious than the one prior. And I guess my question there is like, what do we glean from that? Like, is there that's a question I see a lot floating around online right now. Like, well, if we see all these downward trends in church decline and church attendance and just overall religiosity, what does that say about the future of not just the church in America, but the church globally? Obviously, that's a loaded question. I don't expect you to have the answer, but based off, like, you handle this data more than just about anyone else we know, maybe anyone in America, certainly. Like, what is your personal sentiment about the future of the church in America, given all of this downward decline?
Oh, I've become like the prophet Jeremiah, walking around saying, Babylon's coming. God will not protect you any longer. Like, I honestly, like a significant part of my life now is doing, webinars and Zoom meetings with denominational leaders in major denominations that you all know of. And basically painting a picture of saying, like, I don't know what worked 20 years ago, but sure as the world's not going to work 20 years from now. Like, you can put your head in the sand all you want, but the end is near, friends. Like, when you talk, like, I can give you numbers, like the PCUSA, you had 3.1 million members in 1988. They have 1.1 million members today. On an average Sunday in America, 375,000 Episcopalians go to worship across the country. 375,000 across the country. Right? So, like, you start doing all these numbers and you realize, like, there is no denomination that's the United Methodist Church lost a quarter of its members in the last 18 months. Okay? A quarter of their members in the last 18 months. Talk 2 million people gone in 18 months.
Yeah. Why?
They had a schism.
So it was from that. It was from that. Okay.
Yes. And actually, so what's even more interesting about that is they were losing members before the schism, and now they've lost 25% of their members during the schism, and they're going to lose even more in the aftermath of the schism. So they might go from 8 million to 4.5 million in a 5-year period of time. And they were the second largest denomination in America. Wow. The SBC was 16.2 million in 2006. They're 13.1 million today. They lost 1.3 million in the last 3 years alone. They'll probably be below 10 million people in the next 15 years or so. There will never be a denomination in American life, at least in my lifetime, that will have more than 10 million members. It will probably never happen again. And all this data points to the same conclusion that, now listen, it's not all bad news. There are some denominations that are growing. The ACNA, Anglican Church North America, is growing, but they have less than 500,000 members. Okay, so cool, you're growing. You have 500,000 members. The SBC lost 425,000 last year. So, like, that math ain't mathin'. The PCA has like 400,000 members. They're growing a little bit. The Assemblies of God is growing. They're like over 3 million, almost 3.5 million now, but their growth rate has declined to 1% a year. Now it used to be 3% a year. The only thing that's growing in a real kind of sustainable way is non-denominational Protestant Christianity. They're 22-ish million people now, probably more than that. But, like, that's the future of American religion. The future of American religion is the death of denominations as we know them today. I think in 50 years, there'll be almost no major denominations in the United States, at least not the way that we had them 20 or 30 years ago. It'll be a whole lot of little, like, enclaves of non-denominational churches that have satellites. They might have 75,000 members across 12 churches, all in the Charlotte metro area or in the DFW or wherever it is. But we will not see this institutional Christianity like we have right now. And that means the landscape is much more fragmented. It's much less hierarchical. And I think in some ways we have much less accountability because there's no adult in the room or adult in the head office to come check on you. Because, we always talk about how, like, institutions throughout the Catholic Church failed, the sex abuse scandal, the SBC with all their cover-ups and all these kind of things. If you don't believe that sex abuse is happening in non-denominational churches, it is. You just don't know about it. Yeah, it's happening on these smaller scales, which don't reach national news prominence. But the problems that we're facing as American religion does not go away because we kill denominations. In some ways, it's like cockroaches. Like, they scurry in their own little corners, and it's hard to detect them and harder to prosecute those people and harder to be accountable. So I think that's what the future of American Christianity looks like, is much more fragmented. And think about this too. Think about this one question. Who speaks for evangelicalism in North America right now? I can't name you one person where a majority of evangelicals would all point and go, that's the one.
Oh, Andy Stanley. No.
Yeah.
That was a tough one.
Yeah. I like Andy just fine, but a lot of people don't.
Yeah. He had a good run, right? Like, for a longest time, he would have been like the pinnacle for many. And,
I wish it was Beth Moore. I wish more people would listen to what Beth Moore has to say.
Yeah, Beth. Let's nominate Beth.
Yeah.
Now she's Anglican, by the way.
I know.
So she's not
Hey,
Hey, that's why that denomination is growing.
that's bringing all the people
Exactly
with
right.
her.
Yes, but no, there's really not. I mean, Franklin Graham came out in favor of the vaccine on Facebook, and you should have seen his Facebook comments, guys. It was like, you're the devil. Like there is no one. Like Rick Warren got kicked out of the SBC. Joel Osteen, no one likes Joel Osteen in establishment evangelicalism. Like there is not a single person that can unite evangelical, because like I said, it's so fragmented now. It's not one person. And so the problem is now we're all talking past each other, or our own little circles here, there, and everywhere, and there's not a larger conversation happening inside American evangelicalism, which I think is problematic because now we're not all on the same page. We're all going 50 different directions at once. I just think that's the future. And I don't think it's necessarily a better future than we have right now when it comes to how Protestant Christianity is set up.
Well, even that word, Ryan, that you're using, evangelicalism, like it meant something before and has evolved in a sense where it doesn't mean the same things anymore. And there's data to back this up, that a lot of folks who identify as evangelical are not actually those three B's you mentioned, behavior, belonging, and beliefs. They actually don't identify with a lot of the beliefs historically of evangelicalism, and they certainly don't go to church, and it's become co-opted by a more political movement than anything. And so even that word doesn't mean what it used to. And so for folks who are self-identifying as evangelical, in some cases, they're not even professing Christians any longer. And so we have to wrestle through that as well.
Yeah, 16% of self-identified evangelicals attended less than once a year in 2008. Now it's 27% of evangelicals attend less than once a year. It's become a term. I wrote a piece for the New York Times about this. It's because it's become a synonymous term for I'm white and I'm conservative and I like Donald Trump. We're seeing the rise, by the way, of Muslim evangelicals, Jewish evangelicals, Catholic evangelicals, Hindu evangelicals. And the thing that binds them all together is they're Republicans. So evangelicalism, like in the popular vernacular, does not mean I believe in the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. It means I vote for conservatives and Republicans on election day. So even then, the word has become so, and like I get asked, like, what can we bring it back? I'm like, no, you can't. You know, it's gone. Like it ain't coming back. You don't own words, and you can't say no. Stop using that word. So now the question is like evangelical with a modifier. So what's the modifier? I use the word cultural evangelical a lot to denote these people who don't go to church very often. But that's really the only thing. That's because anything you use there's pejorative almost, like real evangelicals versus cultural evangelicals. Like I'm not in the business saying you are real anything. You tell me you're Catholic, I say you're Catholic. If you say you're evangelical, I think you're evangelical. It's not my job to tell you what you are. It's your job to tell me what you are, and then my job is to figure out why you said that. And so that's what evangelicals. It's jump the fence. It's not a theological term anymore. It's a cultural and political word.
I sometimes feel like I'm pretty bleak on this show, Ryan. I'm glad I brought you on. You're definitely taking that award from me. What about? Okay, I'm going to paint a positive picture of all this. So we're Canadian. We didn't grow up with cultural Christianity really in our nation. We're a lot like the UK, Australia, other Western countries in that sense. Not many people go to church here. If you go to church, it's because you really want to be there.
Yeah.
And could we ascertain from these, changing demographics that perhaps it's the, death of cultural Christianity? Yes, but that's a good thing because the folks that remain are the real true believers. And now tell me why I'm wrong, because this is the only thing I'm holding on to at this point.
Okay, so the corollary for me is this. I'm a mainline Protestant. I'm a pastor in the American Baptist Church. We are the less conservative flavor of the Southern Baptist Convention. So we have female pastors. Some churches are open and affirming, but it's a local church decision, not a national decision. They actually can't tell you what you can do. Your local church, if you don't want female pastors, you don't have to have them either, by the way. It's your choice. But we're seen as being liberal compared to the SBC, which I guess in some ways we are because we're not as conservative as they are. What really grinds my gears is when people call mainline Protestants not real Christians. Because here's how I think about it. Would you, let's create a straw man of the diehard evangelical Southern Baptist, right? Would you rather the 30 million people who go to mainline churches every Sunday not go to church at all or go to a mainline church? I can't imagine what worldview you would say, I'd rather you not be in church at all compared to a church that I don't agree with on issues like women in ministry. That is the issue. I think here's the thing. ISIS, remember ISIS in the Middle East?
Yes.
You know who ISIS killed more of than anyone else? Moderate Muslims. That's who they killed more of than anyone else. They killed very few Christians. because Christians were apostates, and at least they knew they were apostates, right? Like, I don't want to listen. I'm not. Don't hear me wrong. I'm not trying to equate like evangelicals with ISIS, but the same general idea is you dislike people who are closer to you because they're not as close enough to you than you like people who are very far away from you. And I think those purity tests are exactly what's wrong with our country right now. And you see this, by the way, in the United States with the Republican Party. They have the Freedom Caucus and they've got the normie Republicans. And the Freedom Caucus people will burn it down because the normie Republicans will compromise on things like budget issues. And you know what the end result was? We didn't have a Speaker of the House for almost a month. We had to go through like 6 different options because they wanted the perfect speaker. The perfect is the enemy of the good. And I think American Christians need to realize that. Like, I am a whole lot closer to a Southern Baptist than I am an atheist. And yet, because I allow a woman to preach in my church, I'm somehow less than you. I just have a real problem with purity tests. And I think by the way, I think one of the reasons the main line has collapsed is because evangelicals have been saying over and over again in our ears, you're not real Christians. You're not real Christians. I would rather have 100 million people in a mainline church this Sunday than have 100 million people not go to church at all. And I think a lot of evangelicals would not agree with that sentiment. I think that's the primary problem. That's why we're seeing religious polarization in this country, where in the future, all we're going to have are a bunch of evangelicals and traditional Catholics and Muslims and Latter-day Saints and Orthodox Jews on one side, and a whole bunch of nuns on the other side, and nothing in between. There are lots of Americans who would embrace Christianity, but will not embrace a Christianity that is not open and affirming, would not embrace a Christianity that doesn't allow women to have full access to leadership. But the problem is, in most communities across America, there are no churches that do those things because they've been basically purified. And those people have either left or become evangelicals. And I think America functioned better when people had options for religion that weren't none or really conservative evangelicalism. And that's what the future of America looks like, right? I'm actually writing a book about this called The Big Church Sort. Haven't announced it yet, so here, behind the scenes.
Hey, the exclusive.
Yeah, there you go. With Brazos Press, I'm writing a book called The Big Church Sort, basically about how we're not talking enough about religious polarization in this country and how it's destroying us. It's destroying us personally, spiritually, and democratically, little d democratically. Democracy thrives when the church thrives. And the church is not thriving right now because it's not a place where people mix and mingle with people who are different than them. It's all one note, which is almost always conservative republicanism. And I think that's a real problem for a functioning democracy as we go forward. We're worse because of this. And I cannot emphasize that point anymore. You telling mainline Protestants they're not good enough is leading to really bad outcomes. And we're not going to recover from that in the meantime.
That sounds like it mirrors politics in a lot of ways, right? Like most Americans are probably like, hey, I could kind of go for this or for that. But all we hear about is like the extremes on either side. And you're kind of like forced to like pick an extreme almost. And then the, average person is like, I don't know if I feel either of these extremes are kind of insane. It sounds like church is very much the same way. I can't relate to that growing up. I remember there was a Mormon that lived on our little court, and I was like, Mom, they say they believe in Jesus too, and does that mean they go to heaven? Mom was like, you know what? Sure. She's like, why not? She's like, you know what, son? I hope for nothing more that we get to heaven and they're there. And I was like, cool. And then I went to the Pentecostal church, the Baptist church, and they're like, nope, that's heresy. I was like, oh, okay, well, I guess I'm learning that pretty quickly. Shifting gears a bit, Ryan, I came across an article by Pew, and they were discussing generational labels and how, and this kind of gets into like the practice of what you do versus, kind of the outcomes and what we can infer from it, which we've been discussing so far. And Pew was talking about the criticism of generational labels and how it can lead to, generation bashing and how, there's no perfect way of saying this is one generation and it perfectly ends it this year and enters into this next year. And they said, going forward, we're not going to do any research where we can't say at this age, millennials did this and then compare it to boomers at this same age did that, rather than here's what they're both doing in 2024, let's say. What's your take on generational labels? I know that you use them a lot in your data as they are easily understood by most folks. And where do you see maybe the weaknesses, strengths, or what Pew is saying? Does it have merit?
Yeah, so this is a great marketing question, honestly. From an academic perspective, generational labels are absolutely stupid, ridiculous, and meaningless. They make no sense at all. Because, for instance, millennials were born between 1978 and 1995. Oh my God in heaven, is there a difference between some kid born in 1979 and 1994? You know what I mean? Like I was born in 1982. I did not have a texting cell phone until I graduated college. Okay. And now think about someone who's born in 1994. They were 14 when the iPhone came out. Like it's a totally different world. But here's what I know about using generational labels. People eat that stuff up. They love it. And so it's always this constant push and pull. Like at the end of the day, I'm a content creator. And I know some people are like, ooh, don't say those words. I'm a content creator. I create content for Twitter, for Substack, for podcasts, or whatever I do. I create content. And I've been doing it now for a long time. I make 1,500 graphs a year. I've been doing it for the last 5 years in a row. I wrote 250,000 words last year, and I made probably 300, at least 300 graphs for my Substack, at least. So I know what goes and what doesn't go, or I have a better sense than most people. Generations go better than birth cohorts. If you want something to go viral, use generations, don't use birth cohorts. Because for whatever reason, that stuff is just like catnip for the average person. The better way to do it is the one I just told you about, which is birth cohorts, which are 5-year birth windows. We don't label those with cute names like Zennials and, Gen X and all that stuff. It's just 1945 to 1949. That's when you were born. Because those people went to high school together. Like that makes sense to me. The problem is, though, that creates a graph with 16 graphs, not 5. Because generations are only 5 generations or 16 birth cohorts. And if you do multiples of something, like little bitty boxes, it doesn't go as well as doing 5 bigger boxes. Simple goes farther than more complicated. And that's always the constant push and pull between academia and writing for the general audiences. Where do those two Venn diagrams overlap? You want to try to hit the spot where the academic audience doesn't hate what you did, and the general public is not being completely misinformed by using bad measures and bad metrics. That I fall in that trap sometimes. Like sometimes I'll post something and I'll have an academic friend slide in my DM and go, you probably take that down because people are not going to be able to understand that the right way. And I do. So if you create content, the thing you got to know is it's impossible to stay in that pocket all the time. Generations are it's like a quick fix, a quick hit. Like, oh, I need some retweets today. Let me do something with generations. Knowing that it's kind of not that good, not academically rigorous, but also knowing that it's not going away either. We're going to be using those labels for all of humanity and all of eternity because at the end of the day, people still like them. So you have to get the people what they want at some level.
I think media literacy is something that we all can continue to improve on an individual and cultural level. If you were speaking to someone like, hey, here's how you should best interpret data when you do come across the generational labels. What are things that we should look for, and how should we read it? Should it all just be like, with a little bit of an open hand, knowing that it's an imperfect kind of science?
I would say so. Yeah, I think you got to be really, really careful because like these generations are huge. You know what I mean? Like you got to think about like how much things change from the front end of the generation. Even give Gen Z, okay? So Gen Z was born 1996 or later, which means the oldest ones now are about 28 years old. We only start surveying adults. So we're only catching the first 10 years of Gen Z. We're not even catching the back end of it, like the youngest members. And we don't even know when Gen Z ends, by the way, because no one's decided that. Like I don't know if Moses comes down from heaven and like tells us, okay, it ends in, whatever, 2012. I don't know. That's the problem is like when you look at data, especially like I look at the GSS, you look at millennials. The GSS started in 1972. The oldest millennial was born in 1978. So the millennials weren't even start taking the GSS for like halfway through the course of it. So that's the problem is like you got to really think about, okay, how old were these people when they took that survey? Because if they were younger, and then generations change over time, like we just talked about. So I think generational labels are fun because they get the reaction, but methodologically they're incredibly problematic because they're almost amorphous to the point where they don't mean anything.
All right, let's talk about more problematic labels then. So generations, no good. Yeah. Evangelical definitely doesn't mean anything anymore. You tweeted yesterday, very recently, about Protestant versus Christian, and how young folks are almost completely aware of like what Protestant even means, and they are 2.5 times more likely to say that they are Christian rather than Protestant. Can you talk about this development in younger people and what it might mean for making sense of the data and numbers going forward? As apparently, as you already mentioned with the word evangelical, words mean nothing, language can be co-opted at any time, and we're all just trying our best.
Yeah, so no one knows what the word Protestant means. Young people have no clue. So there was a survey that I got a hold of that had 477,000 respondents, and usually what the first couple responses are like, what's your present religion, if any? And here's your responses. Protestant, Catholic, Mormon, Orthodox, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, atheist, agnostic, nothing in particular. And then something else. And then you can write in a box with something else, which is an absolute nightmare. I never look at those.
I'm sure you got some really curious, really curious
I wrote a post
there.
about this like a long time ago where I tried to dig through it, and I was like, I'm getting stupider by the minute. Like some guy wrote like Baptist, why is that not an option? Because he did not know that Protestant was Baptist. One was really like one I think about honestly every day. This guy goes, my wife's a Lutheran and I go to church with her, but I'm an atheist. And I was thinking, okay, so like by one metric you're definitely a Lutheran, but like by another metric you're definitely an atheist. Yeah. Like I don't know what to do with that. So now this other survey I have goes Protestant, Catholic, Mormon, Orthodox, Christian other than above is the fifth option before you get to Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist. So like that's a cool question because then you see like people go, wait a minute, what am I? I'm just a Christian. Check the just Christian box. And so if you look at that like over the age gradient, what you see is that young people, like about 10% of young people know they're Protestant, but like 25% say they're Christian. So, like, they don't know what the word Protestant means. Now, amongst older people, the lines cross, and they're much more likely to say they're Protestant and much less likely to say they're Christian because they know they're Protestant because that was language used with them. You know, like you were Lutheran or Episcopalian or whatever. So the problem is a lot of these churches are so, like, rejecting labels of every kind. I think this is, like, the long tail of the seeker-sensitive movement with Bill Hybels and Rick Warren, guys like, let's take the crosses out of church and let's take the stained glass out of there. Like, let's take the word Protestant, throw away Martin Luther, don't need him. So now people have no sense of religious literacy. And that makes it really, really hard to try to do surveys because it's like, well, how do you know if you're, how do I know the Protestants are actually sorting themselves in the right bucket now? And the answer is, I don't know. I will say this, if you compare that survey to other surveys that don't have the just Christian option, if you add the just Christian plus Protestant together in that one survey, it equals the Protestant in the other survey. So the size is the same, but it's just becoming really, really problematic because people don't know what in the heck they are because pastors are, honestly, pastors, if you're listening to this, will you tell your people they're Protestant at some point, please? Like explain just like a 3-minute Christian history class. You don't have to go in the 95 Theses and Indulgences and the schisms and all that nonsense. Just explain Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation a little bit so people know where they fit in theological and church history because right now they don't know anything. And plus, add to that the fact a lot of these non-denoms don't call themselves churches anymore. We have gatherings. You know, like it's just getting rid of all the labels that are attached to religion. And it's like as a pollster, I'm like, but we need those labels, please. They really help me do my work, so don't get rid of them. Thank you.
Well, and it's not just your work, Ryan. Like I'm a pastor of a non-denominational church. And so like to your earlier point when you were talking about the future of the church in America and how a lot of these mainline denominations that as we know them now and certainly as we have known them in the past are dissolving in a sense and will likely just be rendered into these smaller non-denominational schisms for one word, gatherings for another. And as a non-denominational pastor, I feel that tension of like being untethered in a sense from church history. And I'm learning the importance of, okay, we don't belong to a denomination. We don't often use the word Protestant in our gatherings, but it's really important to know that the history of the church and the history of our faith. And so that's on my radar personally of helping our church along as it pertains to like church history literacy. But I do fear that in a future of more non-denominational churches that are more untethered from the history of Protestant mainline denominations, we lose that sense of history, that sense of place where we have come from and where we're going, and where we are, and that will have a detriment, a negative impact on possibly where we're going.
Oh, I think catechism is a lost art in American religion and worldwide Christianity. Western Protestant Christianity has lost the sense of catechism. Like, I don't think you should sit there and drill your kids on like, you know, these catechistic, but you should. I don't know why every church in America, especially non-denom churches, need to say like, let's have like a 4-week class where we talk about here's what we believe, here's where we fit in the larger Christian story. Like, here's our family, here's our faith tradition. Now, we're closer to, let's say, a Southern Baptist theologically, or culturally, we're closer to the Methodists. Like, there needs to be some sort of like, let's throw a tether out to what exists and say, this is closer to what, like, the whole thing is like, oh, we're not a religion, we're a relationship. Like, that language needs to stop, okay? Like, religion is not a dirty word. Like, I'm part of a religious tradition. You know what? I'm part of a religious tradition that saved my grandfather from alcoholism. Okay, and allowed him to marry my grandmother and have 3 kids. The same faith tradition that persevered and allowed people to come to the new world and face all the trials and tribulations they face, to go through the dark ages. That's the kind of religion I'm a part of. I'm a part of that strand that runs back through history for 2,000 years. And to say, no, my church is too cool. We're a relationship now. So it severs us from our generational past. We are no different than our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents. And to say that we need to just get rid of all that stuff and not use the word Protestant, not use the word religion, not talk about stained glass windows and crucifixion, that is what sustained people for generations. And it will sustain us if we'd allow it. And I think that's my bigger... I look at these young people and go, are you anxious? Do you think life's going well? Because all the data says life is not going well. Well, what did you get rid of over the last 30 years? Now, I'm not saying that everyone becomes religious and life gets magically better, but when you basically tear down all the institutions in history that built Western civilization and you're left with nothing and now you're anxious and upset about it, you might want to return to tradition a little bit. You know, like there's the reason that these things worked is because they worked. You know, religion, think about all the institutions that have died and declined over the last 2,000 years of Western history. The church has not. It still maintains itself because it figured out how to survive every major cataclysmic event facing civilization. And yet the thing that's going to kill it is this generation trying to get rid of history and all institutions. Like, come on, man. Like, we got to stop that stuff. We got to dig back into history. And by the way, that's not saying that everything the church did was great. A lot of it was awful. But St. Augustine once apocryphally said, the church is a whore, but she's my mother. And without the church, we would not have me today. I wouldn't exist. And I think there's something to be said about being proud of that and not papering over or glossing over the horrible atrocities that were committed in the name of religion, but also not minimizing all the good things that religion has brought to the world. We have to do both those things. I think young people would embrace that because they want to see that history.
Well, we insulted Ryan one too many times about being bleak, and then he went and he preached all over us, and I'm grateful, personally. Yeah. Ryan, we want to promote your Substack, Graphs About Religion. We are
and relationships. I mean, if you want to do that too, that's fine.
I am a proud subscriber, paid subscriber. Definitely want to encourage everyone to check this out. Ryan talked about the volume of work that he puts out. If you just kind of are dipping your toes in this, Twitter X is a great follow to get started. But there's nothing quite like Substack. Big fans of Substack, the organization overall. I subscribe to a number of newsletters there, Ryan's included. Goes direct to your inbox. We've got a book on the way. Ryan, what else might people want to connect to your work with?
Yeah, I mean, Twitter's really the hub, although Elon's making my life difficult there. But at Ryan Burge, my Substack is Graphs About Religion, graphsaboutreligion.com. 2 posts a week, 1 free, 1 paid. Actually, not always 1 free, 1 paid. Sometimes it's 2 free. Most of the content is free initially, then it goes behind a paywall after 3 months. I'm coming up on 1 year. I'm at 100 posts now. So you're getting a ton of content from me. 1,500 words, 5-6 graphs every, twice in your inbox a week. I have a book with Oxford University Press called The American Religious Landscape, Facts, Trends, and the Future. It's like a textbook. If you want to see what American religion looks like, this is as far as I can tell, the exhaustive version of that. It's going to come out sometime, probably late this year, early next year. Just signed a contract with Brazos to write a book called The Big Church Sort, which will come out next year, making this argument about how religious polarization is killing America and how we can kind of reinvent what American religion looks like. You can find me at ryanburge.net. You Google me and I pop up. I'm easily findable is what I tell people. It's not hard to find me on the internet.
Outstanding. Well, we appreciate your time so very much. And thank you to everyone watching and listening. We appreciate your kindness, attention, and trust. What? That's not what I say at the end of the show. I have a signature sign-off. I just messed it up.
Your time.
Time. Yeah. Not your kindness. Don't give kindness over a listening.
We're not getting a lot of kindness lately.
Lord, have mercy. Time, attention, and trust.
Overdub that.
We'll talk to you next week. To help us all break it down, we've got Ryan Burge of Graphs About Religion. He's the preeminent source of data on faith and data, but also faith. So let's do